Christmas Eve settled over Manhattan like a held breath. James Whitmore stood alone in his penthouse, a crystal tumbler warming his palm, watching the city slow beneath a veil of falling snow. From 50 floors up, the horns softened, the sirens dulled, and even Central Park looked gentler. Dark paths stitched with white, lights blinking like distant signals no one answered. The apartment was immaculate. Too immaculate. The kind of clean that smelled faintly of lemon polish and money. The Christmas tree stood perfectly shaped near the window, every ornament spaced with careful symmetry. No handmade decorations. No crooked memories. Just glass, gold, and silence. James had once liked silence. He told himself it helped him think. Tonight it pressed against his ears. He checked his phone more out of habit than hope. No new messages. He hadn't expected any. Invitations had stopped years ago, after he'd declined too many times with polite excuses and generous donations. People learned quickly when you preferred distance. Even family learned. He took a sip of bourbon. Too strong. He set the glass down untouched on the marble counter and adjusted the cuff of his shirt, even though there was no one to see it. At 72, his movements were slower but still precise. Control had kept him alive. Control had built everything he could see from that window. Control had also left him here. The fireplace clicked on automatically, flames blooming behind glass. James hadn't lit a real fire in years. Too messy. Too unpredictable. He lowered himself into the leather armchair facing the city, joints protesting softly, and let his gaze drift. Somewhere down there, families were gathering. Children were being shushed to bed. Arguments were being paused, at least for tonight. He told himself he didn't miss any of it. That was the story he'd been telling for decades. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. James stood again, restless, and walked toward the hallway where framed photographs lined the walls. Awards, magazine covers, buildings with his name etched in steel. There was one photo half hidden behind the rest, that he hadn't moved in years. A younger man stood stiffly beside a small boy in a winter coat, both of them squinting at the sun. He didn't touch it. A sharp knock broke the quiet. James froze. No one knocked here. His security knew better. Deliveries didn't come on holidays. His hand went instinctively to the phone. Another knock. Softer this time. "Mr. Whitmore?" A woman's voice called through the door. Careful. Uncertain. "I'm sorry to bother you." He approached slowly, every sense alert. Through the peephole, he saw a woman standing straight despite the cold, a child tucked close against her side. Snow clung to their coats. "I was told you might need some help tonight," the woman continued. "I clean apartments in the building. Your neighbor mentioned you were alone." James exhaled through his nose. Irritation flared first. Then something else, an unease he couldn't name. "It's Christmas Eve," he said through the door, his voice sharper than he intended. "I didn't request anyone." "I know," she replied quickly. "I wouldn't ask if it weren't important. We don't have anywhere else to be right now." The child shifted, hugging a worn stuffed rabbit. James caught a glimpse of wide, watchful eyes. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to say no. To retreat behind the lock, behind the walls he trusted. He imagined the rest of the night unfolding exactly as planned. Quiet, controlled, untouched. But the hallway outside felt colder somehow. The knock lingered in the air. "How long?" he asked finally. "Just a few hours," the woman said. "I can clean, organize, whatever you need. I promise we won't be any trouble." James stared at the door, at the brass handle polished to a dull shine. He told himself this was temporary. That kindness, like everything else, could be measured and contained. He unlocked the door. The woman stepped inside first, eyes lowered in respect, followed by the little girl who looked around in open wonder. The warmth of the apartment wrapped around them immediately. "Thank you," the woman said softly. "My name is Marlene. This is my daughter, Tiana." James nodded once. "You can start in the living room," he said, already turning away. "I'll be here." As they moved deeper into the apartment, the silence shifted. Not broken. Altered. James returned to his chair, but the city outside no longer held his attention. Behind him, He heard the faint rustle of coats being removed. A quiet whisper. A small, surprised laugh from the child as the Christmas tree lights reflected in her eyes. For reasons he didn't understand, James didn't turn the volume up on the television. He listened instead. If you're listening to this story and you've ever spent a holiday feeling unexpectedly alone, you're not the only one. Stories like this have a way of unfolding slowly, so if you want to stay with James through what this night is about to bring, now might be a good time to subscribe and settle in. James shifted in his seat, uneasy. The night was already off script, and as the snow thickened against the windows, he had the unsettling sense that letting them inside had opened more than just his door. He didn't know it yet, but Christmas had only just begun. The quiet that followed their arrival unsettled James more than the silence before it. He retreated into his study, closing the door just enough to dull the faint sounds drifting from the living room. A child's whisper. The soft slide of a cloth against glass. Sounds that didn't belong in his carefully preserved solitude. The study smelled of old books and leather. It was the one room he hadn't redesigned in years. Dark shelves climbed the walls, filled with volumes he rarely opened anymore. Economics, biographies, histories of men who had outlived their enemies and their families. He sank into his desk chair and stared at the surface, where a single object rested near the lamp. A photograph. Not framed. Just slipped under the glass. Cleveland, Ohio. Winter. Long before Manhattan. Long before the money. James had been 8 years old when that picture was taken, standing in front of a brick duplex with snow piled unevenly along the steps. His coat was 2 sizes too big. His mother had insisted it would last him a few winters. His father had taken the photo with a borrowed camera, fingers numb from the cold. They hadn't been poor in the way people imagined. There had been food. There had been warmth. But there was always tension. Unpaid bills folded neatly on the kitchen counter, conversations that stopped when James entered the room. His parents worked constantly and still it never felt like enough. James learned early to listen more than he spoke. He remembered his mother sitting at the small kitchen table late at night, rubbing her temples, staring at numbers that refused to cooperate. He remembered his father coming home exhausted, smelling of oil and metal, trying to sound hopeful and failing. James learned that hope without preparation was dangerous. So he prepared. He studied harder than anyone else in his class. He skipped recess to finish assignments. While other kids dreamed about weekends, James dreamed about escape. He didn't hate his parents. He hated the feeling of being trapped by circumstances he couldn't control. By high school, teachers were calling him promising. By college, they were calling him relentless. And relentless had worked. James leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, listening as the memory filled the room. The first scholarship letter. The first internship. The first time he realized money wasn't just survival, it was power. Power meant no one could ever corner him again. No one could ever make him feel small. Somewhere along the way, connection had become collateral damage. He'd married young. Too young. Back when he still believed balance was possible. The arguments had come quietly at first. Missed dinners, postponed weekends, phone calls taken in other rooms. He told himself it was temporary. That once he reached a certain point, things would slow down. They never did. The marriage ended not with shouting, but with exhaustion. 2 people sitting at opposite ends of a table, realizing they had become strangers who shared history and little else. His son had been too young to understand then. Old enough to understand later. James opened his eyes. From beyond the study door came a faint, unexpected sound, a small laugh. High and bright. It startled him. He hadn't heard a child laugh in years. Not in this apartment. Not anywhere near him. He glanced at the photograph again. Back then he had believed loneliness was a temporary condition. Something you endured on the way to something better. He hadn't realized it could calcify. Settle into your bones. A soft knock touched the study door. James stiffened. Yes. Marlene's voice came through, cautious but steady. I just wanted to let you know, we're almost finished in the living room. We'll stay out of your way. That's fine, he replied automatically. There was a pause. Your tree is beautiful, she added. Very intentional. He almost laughed at that. Almost. When her footsteps retreated, James remained seated, staring at the desk. Intentional. That word followed him everywhere. It had justified his absences, his distance, his choices. Another sound drifted in, Tiana humming softly, off-key, completely unconcerned with perfection. James stood slowly and walked to the window of his study. Outside, snow continued to fall, steady and patient, covering the sharp edges of the city. Cleveland had looked like this once. Quieter. Smaller. Before ambition had taught him to outrun memory. He felt something shift inside his chest. Not pain. Not warmth. Something unsettled. Like a door he'd sealed long ago had begun to creak under pressure. For the first time that night, James wondered what might happen if he stopped running from who he had been. And whether the people in his living room, strangers an hour ago, were about to remind him of something he'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. James remained by the window longer than he intended, tracing the slow drift of snowflakes against the city lights. The apartment felt different now, somehow larger but smaller at the same time, as if the space was adjusting to the presence of others. He could hear Tiana's quiet footsteps on the polished floor, the soft scrape of Marlene moving a chair, and a small cough that echoed through the high ceilings. He turned back toward the living room, noticing how the reflections of the Christmas tree lights danced across the walls, catching the edge of his impeccable furniture. He had always preferred perfection, symmetry, control, but tonight, those same elements felt cold, almost oppressive. James took a slow breath. He could feel the weight of his life pressing down on him. The empty apartment, the absent family, the estranged son, the decades of careful ambition. All of it sat in the corners like dust he had been ignoring. He had created a world that kept people out, and now, with Marlene and Tiana quietly going about their tasks, he realized how stark that world had become. He remembered the first time he had truly felt independent, the first taste of wealth that had made him believe he was untouchable. College dorm room, ramen and books piled high, late-night phone calls with his father, who had no idea how close he had come to failure that semester. That drive, that hunger, had carried him for decades. But what had it left him with? A penthouse. A perfect tree. Silence. A soft voice pulled him from the memory. Mr. Whitmore? Marlene's voice, gentle but firm. Do you ever step outside for Christmas? James frowned. The question was odd, almost childlike, but it wasn't an insult. There was a humility in it, a quiet observation of the life he led. I haven't, he admitted. Not for years. Tiana appeared beside Marlene, tugging at her mother's sleeve. Why not? She asked, her small face full of curiosity. Christmas is fun. James exhaled slowly, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. Fun. A concept he had long misplaced. He wanted to answer with reason, with explanation, but no logic fit. I suppose I have been busy, he said finally. Marlene's eyes lingered on him, a mixture of understanding and caution. Being busy can't protect you from being alone, she said softly. The words landed differently than any business memo or lecture could have. They weren't judgmental. They were a statement, an observation of truth. James felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. He wandered over to the sofa, sat down, and watched them. Tiana, oblivious to the weight of his life, was stacking ornaments, trying to balance one precariously on top of another. She wobbled, laughed, and adjusted it with care. Marlene hummed quietly, moving with practiced efficiency. The room, previously sterile and silent, now had rhythm, life, and a strange warmth. James sipped the bourbon he had left on the side table earlier. It was bitter, rough, grounding. He didn't need it to remember who he was, but he needed it to steady the unfamiliar flutter inside him. He remembered an old lesson, one his father had attempted to teach him in Cleveland. Life was less about the control you exercised and more about how you responded when control slipped through your fingers. He had spent decades perfecting control, and now he faced something he couldn't regulate. A small child and her mother, neither of whom had any obligation to be in his life. The minutes stretched, long and quiet. James could hear the soft tick of the clock, the occasional scrape of furniture, the low hum of traffic below. Each sound reminded him that life went on outside of his carefully arranged bubble, that people existed beyond his calculation. Then Tiana stopped moving. She stepped back, eyes wide, and pointed toward the window. "Mom, look." James followed her gaze. The snow had grown heavier. On the street below, a man huddled against the curb, wrapped in a thin coat that barely shielded him from the cold. He held a cardboard sign in trembling hands. The city, usually indifferent, suddenly felt sharp and immediate. Marlene followed James's gaze. Her voice was quiet, urgent. "Sir, he's going to freeze." James felt the familiar rise of hesitation, the logic of his old instincts telling him to ignore it. It wasn't his problem. It wasn't his responsibility. The walls he had built all these years whispered at him to stay inside. But Tiana's eyes, amber and wide with concern, caught his. There was no judgment in them, only the pure, raw clarity of a child noticing suffering. And in that moment, James realized the first truth of the night. Wealth could build walls, but it could not insulate you from what you felt when faced with humanity. He reached for his coat. The first snowflake landed on his sleeve, cold and sharp, and James Whitmore, billionaire, had no idea that a simple act of stepping outside would begin to crack open a lifetime of carefully preserved solitude. The man on the street didn't know he was about to become part of someone else's story, and neither did James. As the apartment lights flickered softly behind him, James took his first uncertain steps into a night that would change everything. And just as he opened the door, the wind carrying the city's quiet urgency, he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing in his life would ever feel the same again. The door swung open with a faint creak, and the cold air hit James like a wall. Snowflakes dusted his hair and coat, melting immediately against the warmth of his skin. The streets below were emptying quickly, the city softened under a thick layer of white. Streetlights cast halos through the snowfall, and James realized he hadn't felt air this sharp in years. The man huddled on the curb looked smaller than expected, a shadow under a thin, worn coat. He shifted, shivering violently, and James felt an almost reflexive tightening in his chest. Logic whispered, "Stay inside. Observe. Ignore." It had served him well for decades. But another voice, quieter, firmer, nudged him forward, a voice he hadn't recognized in years. Empathy. "Sir, do you need help?" James called down. The man lifted his head slowly, eyes wary but pleading. Snow had plastered his hair to his forehead. His lips moved, but the wind swallowed the words. James climbed the steps, each footfall echoing against the empty street. The man didn't move, or perhaps he didn't believe he would. James crouched, careful not to startle him, and tugged his coat tighter around his shoulders. "I've got a cab waiting," James said, voice steady, businesslike, the part of him that had built empires taking over. "Come with me. You'll be warm in a few minutes." The man hesitated, and for a moment, James thought he might refuse. Then, slowly he rose, trembling, his hands wrapped around James's extended arm. The small warmth of human contact was startling. James realized he hadn't touched someone outside a family context, or any family really, in decades. By the time they reached the cab, James's gloves were damp, and his coat dusted with snow. Tiana had appeared at the window of the penthouse, pressed against the glass, watching. Her small hand waved, and James felt a strange, uncharacteristic surge of pride. He was doing something right in her eyes for once. The cab ride was silent. James didn't know what to say. Words had always been tools, carefully measured, but here they felt unnecessary. He handed the man a thick wool blanket and ensured he had the shelter's address. Finally, the man nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of gratitude. Back in the penthouse, James removed his coat, snowflakes clinging stubbornly to the collar. The apartment felt warmer, softer somehow, though it was the same temperature as before. Tiana was curled on the couch, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, eyes wide. You helped him?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," James said simply. Marlene approached cautiously, a hint of a smile on her face. "That was kind," she said. "Very few people do that without hesitation." James shook his head. "I don't know if it's kind. I just did it." Her eyes studied him, perceptive, gentle. Sometimes doing is enough, she said. The quiet returned, but it felt different now. Alive. Charged. Full of unspoken questions and possibilities. James sank into the armchair near the fireplace, watching the flames flicker across the walls. For the first time in a long while, he felt an ache that was neither loneliness nor discomfort, something deeper. A reminder that life, connection, and presence could not be replaced with money, control, or perfection. Hours passed. The bourbon on the side table grew cold. Outside, the city lights blinked through the falling snow. Tiana had fallen asleep on the couch, her small body rising and falling in gentle rhythm. Marlene sat beside her, a quiet guardian, watching her daughter with love and caution. James's gaze drifted to the window, to the silent streets below, to the world he had ignored for decades. He realized that this one night, a child, a mother, a stranger, had already begun to reshape something inside him. And yet, the night was far from over. A call on his phone vibrated insistently against the marble counter. He reached for it, expecting perhaps a wrong number, a routine notification. Instead, the screen flashed a name that had not been part of his life for years. Lucas, his son. James stared at the number, frozen, as the snow continued to fall outside. The cab had returned the man to safety, the apartment was quiet, and yet James felt a storm rising inside. A storm that could change everything he thought he knew about his life, his choices, and the people he had left behind. A story he had avoided for decades was demanding to be faced. And in that instant, James understood that the night would not end quietly. James stared at the phone, thumb hovering over the screen, heart thumping in a rhythm he hadn't felt in decades. He hadn't spoken to Lucas in nearly 10 years, not since the last argument that ended in silence, doors slammed, and distance that felt permanent. The city outside continued its slow, indifferent drift of snow, but inside, the room suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if pressing him toward a choice he wasn't ready to make. He set the phone down, but only for a moment. The vibration repeated, soft, persistent. Each buzz was a reminder that some things could not be ignored, no matter how carefully constructed his walls were. Lucas, he muttered under his breath, the name tasting foreign on his tongue. A memory flickered. His son as a boy, holding a baseball glove too big for his hands, eyes bright, asking questions James had been too busy to answer. He closed his eyes, swallowing against the sudden ache. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. Tiana, who had been watching quietly from the couch, peered at him with those wide amber eyes. "Who is it?" she asked innocently, holding her stuffed rabbit like a shield. "Someone from my past," James replied, his voice tighter than he intended. "Family." She tilted her head. "Are they nice?" James managed a small, humorless chuckle. "Not always." Marlene appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Everything okay?" "Yes, fine," James said, though he was anything but. He tried to focus on the warmth of the apartment, the soft hum of the heater, the gentle flicker of the fireplace, the smell of pine and dust mingled from the tree. But the quiet now felt restless, charged with the possibility of confrontation. He had avoided these moments for so long, relying on distance and silence as shields. Tonight those shields felt useless. He walked to the window, staring down at the street below. The cab had gone, leaving only footprints fading into the snow. James's mind raced through all the conversations he had never had, the words left unsaid, the apologies he hadn't offered. He realized that the night, already unpredictable, was demanding more of him than he had expected. "I have to take it," he said finally, picking up the phone. The line clicked and Lucas's voice came through, rough, uncertain, but unmistakably his own. "Dad, Mom's in the hospital. She's asking for you. Please, come." James felt his chest tighten. Helen, his mother. A woman who had been a constant in his life but also a source of silent tension, judgment, and expectation. She had shaped him, molded him, and also left scars he had carried into every boardroom, every deal, every empty apartment. "I'll be there," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. He hung up and set the phone down slowly. His mind whirled. The neat, controlled evening he had planned, the life he had carefully insulated, had been swept aside by a single call. For the first time he felt that his wealth, his power, even his meticulously planned solitude, none of it could shield him from the real consequences of the past. Tiana, sensing the tension, moved closer. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," James said, though he didn't believe it yet. I need to go see someone." Marlene nodded, understanding without question. "Do you want me to come with you?" James hesitated. The thought of going to the hospital, confronting old wounds, facing family he had avoided, it was overwhelming. But then he looked at Tiana, the small child who had reminded him of the world outside his carefully constructed life, and something shifted. Perhaps he didn't need to face it alone. "Thank you," he said finally. "Yes, come with me." He grabbed his coat again, brushing snow from his shoulders, and glanced back at the warm apartment. The fire still crackled, the tree still glowed, and for a fleeting moment he wished he could stay. But the night was moving him forward, and it would not be denied. Before leaving he paused, looking at Tiana. "Take care of each other tonight," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "We will." James felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation as he stepped into the snow once more. Every crunch beneath his shoes echoed like a warning, or a promise, that this Christmas night would not be ordinary. It would challenge him, confront him, and perhaps, if he was brave enough, change him. And as the elevator doors closed, the penthouse lights fading behind him, James Whitmore had no idea what awaited him at the hospital. The night was far from over, and the first real test of his life beyond money, power, and isolation was about to begin. James stepped out of the taxi, the city air sharp against his cheeks, biting in a way that reminded him of winters long past. Snow crunched beneath his shoes as he pulled the coat tighter around his shoulders. Marlene followed closely, Tiana's small hand wrapped securely in her mother's, keeping pace as best she could. The hospital loomed ahead, sterile and bright, its facade glowing under the snowfall. Inside, the scent of antiseptic hit him immediately, a smell so clinical it seemed to scrub away the last traces of warmth from the world outside. He followed Marlene and Tiana into the lobby, avoiding eye contact with the few nurses and night staff bustling past. James hadn't set foot in a hospital in years. The smell, the quiet beeps, the hushed conversations, they all felt foreign. And then there was Helen, his mother. Frail, small in her hospital bed, the skin of her hands thinner than he remembered. She looked at him with sharp eyes softened by age, the authority he had feared and respected in childhood now tinged with vulnerability. "James?" she whispered, voice fragile but unmistakable. "You came." "I did," he said, moving to her side, trying to steady the emotion that threatened to unbalance him. There was a silence that stretched longer than either of them expected, filled only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. James felt a tension he hadn't realized he was holding, the same tension he had carried through boardrooms, through years of ambition, and through the careful walls of his apartment. "Mom?" "I didn't know," he began, but the words faltered. He wasn't used to conversations that didn't involve negotiation or strategy. He was used to controlling situations, not sitting helpless beside a hospital bed. Helen's eyes glistened and she reached out, touching his hand lightly. "Life doesn't wait for perfection," she said softly. "Not for me, not for you. You've been alone for too long." James swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to explain, to justify. Instead he listened. And in that listening he realized the weight of years, the regrets, the missed chances. The hospital room felt smaller than his penthouse, but somehow more real, more urgent. Marlene and Tiana waited in the corner, the little girl clutching her rabbit, wide-eyed but quiet. Their presence was grounding, reminding James of the warmth he had allowed in, however briefly. He glanced at them, a subtle acknowledgement passing through his gaze. The conversation with Helen continued, halting and fragile. Memories were dredged up, some sharp, some soft. Words unspoken for decades stumbled into the room, tentative but necessary. James realized that this was not reconciliation in the dramatic sense, no sudden hugs or tears, but something slower, rawer, acknowledgement. Hours seemed to condense into minutes as they sat together. Helen spoke of small regrets, the moment she had missed being a mother to him in ways that mattered. James admitted to errors, to absences, to a life measured in transactions instead of time. There was tension, yes, and pride, but also the faintest glimmer of understanding. As the night edged toward dawn, James stepped back into the hospital corridor. His heart was heavier than when he had arrived, but lighter in unexpected ways. Life had confronted him with a reality he had avoided for decades, and he had survived the encounter. More than survived, he had begun to feel it. Outside, the snow had begun to ease, turning into a gentle drizzle. James walked back toward the taxi, feeling Marlene and Tiana close behind, and noticed the city differently now. It wasn't just a landscape of glass and steel, it was full of lives, stories, and moments he had ignored, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously. He knew the night wasn't over. The penthouse awaited, and with it, the quiet that had both comforted and imprisoned him. But for the first time, James sensed that silence didn't have to be empty. It could hold space for connection, for observation, for reflection. As they reached the taxi, James allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The night had demanded confrontation, had demanded presence. And he had answered, imperfectly but genuinely. The city lights flickered in the snow, and James realized that no matter how late it was, or how cold the night, change had begun to stir. The penthouse greeted them with warmth as soon as the door closed behind them. The heat hummed softly through the vents, the Christmas tree lights still glowing patiently as if they had never left. James paused just inside the doorway, removing his coat slowly, his mind still lingering in the hospital room. The steady beeping, his mother's thin hand around his fingers, the words that had landed heavier than any deal he had ever signed. Tiana slipped off her boots and padded inside, eyes bright despite the late hour. "It still smells like Christmas," she said, inhaling deeply. Marlene smiled tiredly. "That's the tree, baby." James watched them move through the space he had spent years treating like a showroom. Now it felt lived in, even if only temporarily. The couch cushions were slightly out of place. A blanket lay folded where Tiana had slept earlier. Small signs of life that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Would you like something warm?" Marlene asked gently. "Cocoa, maybe? It helps after the cold." James hesitated. The idea felt strangely intimate. But he nodded. That would be fine. They gathered in the kitchen, the sound of the kettle filling the quiet. Tiana climbed onto one of the tall stools, swinging her legs as Marlene measured cocoa powder with practiced ease. James leaned against the counter, hands tucked into his pockets, watching. "You live very high up," Tiana said suddenly, glancing toward the windows. "Do you ever get scared?" James considered the question. "Of heights?" "No. Not heights," she said. "Of being by yourself." The kettle clicked off. Marlene stilled for half a second, then continued pouring water as if nothing had happened. James exhaled slowly. "I suppose I didn't used to," he said. "I thought being alone meant I was safe." Tiana frowned, processing this. "Safe from what?" He almost smiled. "Almost. From needing people." Marlene handed him a mug, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Needing people isn't a weakness," she said quietly. "It just feels like one when you've had to do everything on your own." They carried the mugs to the living room. The fire cast a low, steady glow, shadows stretching and shrinking across the walls. James sat on the edge of the armchair while Tiana curled up on the rug, blowing carefully across the surface of her drink. "So," Marlene said after a moment, settling onto the couch. "You grew up in Ohio?" James nodded. "Cleveland. My aunt lives near there," she said. "Cold winters. Tough people." "Tough," he agreed. "Sometimes too tough." The conversation moved slowly, cautiously, like stepping across ice you weren't sure would hold. James spoke about school, about working too much, about believing that once he reached a certain point, life would finally begin. Marlene listened without interruption, without judgment. Tiana yawned, resting her head against the couch. "I think Christmas is better when people talk," she murmured. "Even when they don't say nice things." James looked at her, surprised. "Why's that?" "Because quiet can make your head loud," she said, eyes already closing. Marlene smiled softly, brushing her daughter's hair back. She's not wrong. James felt something loosen inside him. He stared into his mug, watching the steam curl upward and disappear. For years he had filled his life with noise, meetings, travel, negotiations, just to avoid this kind of quiet. And yet, here it was, gentle instead of crushing. I don't usually do this, he said suddenly. Talk like this. Marlene met his gaze. You're doing fine. There was a pause. Not awkward. Thoughtful. You didn't have to help us tonight, she added. Or that man outside. Or invite us back in after the hospital. I know, James said. I'm not sure why I did. Maybe you are, she replied. Tiana was asleep now, her breathing slow and even. James watched her chest rise and fall, a strange protectiveness settling over him. He realized how long it had been since someone had trusted him simply to be present. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. James stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the softened city. The snow had stopped completely. Everything looked paused as if waiting. Behind him, Marlene spoke again, her voice lower. What happens in the morning? He didn't answer right away. Morning had always been easy, structured, predictable. Nights like this were harder. I don't know, he admitted. But, you're welcome to stay. Marlene nodded, relief flickering across her face. Thank you. James returned to his chair, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't counting hours or planning exits. Still, beneath the warmth and the quiet conversation, something unsettled him. A sense that this fragile peace was temporary. That whatever had begun tonight would demand more of him than cocoa and conversation. And as he sat there, listening to the fire crackle and the city breathe below, James couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of the night was still waiting to be revealed. The next morning arrived slowly, pale sunlight spilling through the tall windows of the penthouse. Snow had softened to a glittering white blanket over the city streets below, cars trudging through slush, pedestrians bundled against the cold. James stood by the window watching the quiet city wake. He had slept little, thoughts of the hospital, his mother, and last night's unexpected visitors looping in his mind. Tiana was already up, her small footsteps light on the polished floor as she explored the living room with the curiosity only a child could manage. She paused by the Christmas tree, reaching out to touch an ornament, then turned and looked at James. Do you ever go outside just to see things? She asked, her voice bright and inquisitive. James raised an eyebrow. You mean without purpose? Yes, she said, shrugging. Just to watch people or snow or life. He considered her question, realizing that he hadn't done that, not without an agenda, not in decades. He felt a tug of envy at her innocence, the way she could simply observe and be present. Marlene joined them in the kitchen, moving quietly as she prepared a small breakfast. The smell of toast and brewed coffee filled the apartment, mixing oddly with the lingering pine of the Christmas tree. James hesitated, then spoke. I saw someone outside last night. A man, struggling in the snow. Marlene paused, her hands on the counter. Oh. I helped him, James said, surprising himself with the admission. I didn't plan to, but I did. Tiana's eyes widened. Really? You went outside? Yes, he said, and for the first time in a long while, the words felt truthful. It wasn't easy. The small breakfast passed quietly. Tiana chatted about school projects, Marlene responded with gentle guidance, and James listened more than he spoke. It felt strange but not uncomfortable. He was noticing patterns of life he had long ignored, the soft sound of laughter spilling naturally, the smell of toast popping from the toaster, the way sunlight reflected off the ornaments and sparkled across the floor. After breakfast, Tiana wandered toward the window again, pressing her hands against the glass. Look, Mom, she said, pointing to a small group of children building a snowman across the street. Their laughter rang clear even from this height, and James realized he hadn't heard such joy in years. Children, Marlene said, a small smile tugging at her lips. So loud. So alive. James watched, feeling a curious mix of nostalgia and regret. He remembered winters like that in Cleveland, snowball fights with neighbors, the smell of hot chocolate warming cold hands. But those memories were distant, hazy, and largely abandoned. Tonight he realized he had the chance to rediscover them, not as a child but as someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding presence. Tiana turned to him suddenly. "Do you have anyone?" James frowned. "Anyone? Family," she said simply. "Or friends? People you go outside with?" He shook his head, quiet this time, the answer heavy on his tongue. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the apartment settling. Marlene stepped closer. "It's not too late," she said softly. "To notice people. To let life in." James considered that, the words echoing in his mind. He had built walls so high that very few had ever crossed them, and those who had were gone, left behind by choice or circumstance. But the presence of Marlene and Tiana, gentle and insistent, was beginning to erode those walls in small, almost imperceptible ways. A soft knock at the door broke the reflective silence. James glanced toward it, frowning. "Who's there?" A messenger stood there, gloves dusted with snow. "Delivery for Mr. Whitmore. Signature required." He signed quickly, expecting the usual stack of reports or luxury catalogs. Instead, the small package felt different. Inside was a small box wrapped neatly in brown paper with no sender's name. He set it on the table and opened it slowly. Inside lay a handwritten note. "Sometimes the smallest warmth can guide you through the coldest night." Beneath the note was a simple ornament, a tiny snow globe depicting a small house with light in every window. James turned it over in his hands, feeling an unfamiliar weight in his chest. He had not expected this, not from anyone. Not now. Not like this. Tiana gasped, pointing at the ornament. "It's a house. With lights. It's alive." James chuckled quietly, a dry, almost embarrassed sound. "Yes," he said. "It is." But as he placed the snow globe on the mantel, something inside him stirred. The night was still young. The city outside, the hospital visit, the small gestures of presence. All of it hinted at something larger, something he couldn't yet define. And he knew deep down that before the night was over, he would be tested in ways far beyond snow globes, cocoa, or polite conversation. Because life had a way of forcing truth, even in the most controlled lives. The rest of the day passed slowly, a quiet rhythm settling over the penthouse that felt unfamiliar to James. Tiana played with small figurines near the Christmas tree, her laughter punctuating the occasional silence. Marlene moved through the apartment with efficiency and care, tidying as she went but never imposing. James stayed mostly by the windows, gazing out at the city below, lost in thought. Yet something about the snow globe on the mantel kept drawing his attention. He found himself reaching for it repeatedly, turning it in his hands, watching the tiny flakes swirl around the illuminated miniature house. It was a simple object, yet it carried an unexpected weight, a strange reminder that warmth could exist in the smallest, most deliberate places. Around mid-afternoon, a knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone. Delivery had already come, the city was quiet, and the penthouse security protocol was strict. "Mr. Whitmore?" A voice called, hesitant but firm. James approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole he saw a woman standing there, her coat dusted with snow. She wasn't Marlene nor anyone he knew. He opened the door. "Yes." "Excuse me," she said, hands folded in front of her. "My name is Felicia Turner. I work with your foundation." James raised an eyebrow. He hadn't remembered inviting anyone over today. "My foundation?" She nodded. "We've noticed a discrepancy in the holiday allocations. Some donations weren't processed correctly. I came to ensure that everything is handled before the end of the year." James felt a familiar twinge, a mixture of irritation and controlled curiosity. He had built an empire, yes, but it always came with responsibility. "Show me the paperwork," he said, stepping aside. As Felicia entered, Marlene glanced up from her tidying. "I'll make some tea," she offered softly, sensing the tension rising. James nodded absently, following Felicia into the study. He scanned the reports she spread across the desk. At first glance they seemed standard. numbers, allocations, signatures. But then something caught his eye. A significant donation intended for a children's shelter in the Bronx had been diverted to an unknown account. How? He muttered, scrolling through the entries. This is impossible. Felicia frowned. It shouldn't be. The system is secure. Unless. James felt a chill beyond the air conditioning. Unless someone tampered with it? Felicia hesitated. Yes. Or there's been an internal error. Either way, it needs immediate attention. He pinched the bridge of his nose. For decades, James had managed wealth with precision. This kind of uncertainty felt like a personal affront. Marlene appeared in the doorway, holding a tray of tea. Do you want some? James waved her off. Not now. His eyes were fixed on the numbers, on the possibility that someone had bypassed his controls, even temporarily. Felicia, trace everything. Now. She nodded and began typing furiously on her laptop. The apartment was quiet again, punctuated by the hum of the heater, the clatter of keys, and Tiana's occasional murmur as she observed from the living room. Hours passed. James stood over the desk, frustrated, tense, heart thumping. Then Felicia looked up, her face pale. It's unusual, she said. The account these funds went to, it's linked to a former employee. Someone who left years ago. Someone who might have wanted to test the system. James's jaw tightened. His mind flashed to betrayal, deception, and the years of control he had prided himself on. He had never imagined that even at this late stage someone could circumvent his oversight. He turned to Felicia. Who? The name, it's Thomas Green. Something inside him shifted. Thomas Green had been his closest aide, his right-hand man for over 20 years. Loyal, meticulous, trusted. The man who had left quietly after a personal dispute with James a decade ago. And now, a decade later, he was resurfacing, not with words but with action. James exhaled slowly, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and an unfamiliar uncertainty washing over him. Everything he had built, every system, every safeguard, it was not invulnerable. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of vulnerability pressing in. Tiana wandered closer, tugging at Marlene's sleeve. Mom, what's wrong? Marlene whispered softly, guiding her back. Nothing for you to worry about, baby. But James didn't feel reassured. The warmth of the apartment, the comfort of company, even the snow globe, all of it seemed fragile now. Outside forces, hidden hands, mistakes or malice, they could still reach him even here, even now. And in that moment he realized that the night's surprises weren't over. Not by a long shot. James sat back in his chair, feeling the tight knot of tension in his chest refuse to loosen. The snow globe on the mantel caught his eye, its tiny house glowing softly in the morning light, and for a moment, it felt like a lifeline, an anchor in a world that was suddenly unstable. But even that small warmth couldn't erase the gnawing realization. Someone he had trusted, someone he had depended on for decades, had breached his control. Thomas Green, he muttered under his breath. The name echoed through the study like a challenge. Years of precision, years of careful oversight, suddenly undermined by one man's deliberate action. James had built walls, routines, safeguards, but no system could anticipate human unpredictability, not even from those closest. Felicia continued typing, her brow furrowed in concentration. I can trace the transactions, she said quietly. See where the money went, if it's recoverable, and if this was a targeted action or a random diversion. James exhaled slowly, running his hands through his hair. Do it, he said finally. I need a full picture. Now. The minutes stretched as they worked, silence punctuated only by the click of keys and Tiana's small voice drifting in from the living room. She had climbed onto the arm of the couch, rabbit in hand, eyes wide and curious. Mr. Whitmore, she said innocently, why is everyone so serious? James glanced at her, then at Marlene, and managed a small, humorless smile. Sometimes, he said carefully, people forget to have fun when things go wrong. She tilted her head. But Christmas is for fun. He almost laughed, a dry, ragged sound that hadn't touched his lips in years. Almost. There was an innocence in her observation, a truth he had long buried beneath contracts and accounts and careful control. Hours passed. Felicia uncovered more details. Thomas Green hadn't simply made a diversion. He had sent a small portion of the funds to a series of untraceable accounts before redirecting the remainder to the intended shelter, an intricate maneuver that suggested not only insider knowledge but a deep understanding of James's methods. James felt a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. The man had challenged him, pushed him into a corner. And for the first time in decades, James felt vulnerable. "I want to confront him," James said abruptly, the decision firming in his mind. "I need to know why. Face to face." Felicia hesitated. "It could be dangerous. We don't know his motives. We don't know if he's acting out of revenge or something else." James's gaze sharpened. "I don't care. I've faced worse than him. And if this is personal, I want answers." Marlene approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "It's not too late to wait to handle this carefully." James shook his head. "No. Waiting only gives him leverage. I built my life around control, and if I allow him to manipulate it from the shadows, I lose more than money. I lose authority. I lose myself." Tiana watched him, silent now, sensing the tension even if she didn't fully understand it. Her small hands tightened around her rabbit. By mid-afternoon, James had made arrangements. Felicia would trace every account, every movement, ensuring there were no additional surprises. James would contact Thomas directly, a private conversation to uncover motives and determine the next steps. But even as he prepared, a quiet unease settled over him. The night's earlier events, the hospital, the snow globe, the warmth of Marlene and Tiana, felt distant now, replaced by a challenge he hadn't anticipated. The fragility of his carefully ordered life was laid bare, and he realized that the presence of others, help, warmth, connection, was no shield against betrayal. The penthouse felt strangely empty despite the company around him. Even the Christmas tree, once a symbol of careful perfection, now seemed like a reminder that life could intrude, unannounced and uncontrollable. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, James prepared for a confrontation he hadn't imagined this Christmas Eve. Every step of his meticulously structured world seemed suddenly fragile, every decision weighted with consequences. He glanced at Marlene, who gave him a quiet nod of support, and then at Tiana, asleep once again, rabbit clutched to her chest. The night had already begun to test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. And he knew that before this Christmas ended, James Whitmore's life would be confronted not just by the past, not just by strangers or family, but by the very consequences of control, and the truths he had long avoided. James sat in his study, the city skyline darkening behind him as night settled over Manhattan. The penthouse felt quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if the space itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Felicia's laptop glowed softly on the desk, displaying a map of transactions, accounts, and digital trails that led back to Thomas Green. Every line, every number, was a testament to how much the man knew, and how audacious he had become. James rubbed his temples, trying to suppress the frustration that had been building since morning. For decades he had controlled every detail of his empire. Every decision, every dollar, every hire had been deliberate, calculated. Yet here he was, blindsided by a former ally, realizing that experience, strategy, and caution weren't always enough. A knock at the door broke his focus. "Come in," he called. Marlene entered first, her presence calm but grounded. Tiana trailed behind, tugging at her mother's coat. "Are you going to talk to the bad man now?" she asked innocently. James glanced at the child, a dry smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I suppose so," he said. "But he's not exactly a storybook villain." Tiana frowned. "Then why is he bad?" James sighed. "Sometimes people make choices we don't understand. Choices that hurt others even if they think they're justified." Marlene crouched slightly, bringing herself to eye level with the girl. "Do you understand?" Tiana shrugged, a little confused, but nodded slowly. "Sort of." James turned his attention back to the phone. He had Thomas's number, An old line that had never been disconnected, and dialed carefully, each digit precise. The line rang and he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Anticipation, caution, and something more primal, a mixture of anger and curiosity. "Hello." A familiar voice answered, smooth and controlled, carrying a hint of amusement. "Thomas," James said, voice firm. "We need to talk." Pause. James. "It's been a while." "Too long," James replied, his tone clipped. "I'm aware of what you did with the foundation funds. I want to know why." Another pause. The sound of papers shuffling faintly in the background. Then Thomas spoke, deliberately slow. "Why? Isn't it obvious? You've spent decades controlling everything. Every donation, every dollar. Every life you touch, calculated. I wanted to see if the great James Whitmore could be surprised." James felt his chest tighten. Surprise. Audacity. Contempt. All tangled together. You put children at risk. People who needed help. That wasn't a game. Thomas's voice softened, almost conversational. "I didn't endanger anyone. The funds reached the shelter eventually, didn't they?" James exhaled slowly, anger mixing with reluctant admiration. "You're clever. I'll give you that. But clever doesn't excuse betrayal. It doesn't excuse deception from someone I trusted." Thomas chuckled softly. "Trust is fragile, James. Especially when people like you build walls higher than the sky. I only wanted to test them." James slammed a hand onto the desk, startling Tiana, who had come closer to watch. "Walls are not built for amusement. They're built to protect everything we've worked for." Thomas's voice remained calm, almost too calm. "Exactly. And yet here we are. You're feeling something tonight that money couldn't buy, control couldn't maintain. Vulnerability. Loneliness. The presence of others." James's mind flickered to Marlene, to Tiana, to the hospital visit, to the snow globe. Every moment of warmth and connection, and now Thomas was exposing a fracture he had long ignored. "Why now?" James asked, voice low. "Why test me tonight of all nights?" There was silence. Then quietly, "Because some lessons are best learned when the walls feel absolute. When the person behind them thinks they're untouchable." James leaned back, eyes narrowing. He realized that Thomas's game was more than financial manipulation. It was psychological, probing weaknesses that even James hadn't admitted existed. "Fine," James said finally, voice measured. "We will talk more. But understand this, any further misstep, any risk to people who depend on me, and it won't just be a conversation." Thomas chuckled one last time. "Understood, James. Merry Christmas." The line went dead. James sat in silence, processing the encounter. He had survived boardroom battles, hostile takeovers, betrayals, but this was different. This was personal, emotional. It exposed a part of himself he had long hidden. A man capable of power, yes, but still human, still vulnerable, still yearning for connection he had avoided for decades. Marlene approached, sensing the storm in his mind. "Are you okay?" James exhaled, finally allowing himself a long, slow breath. "I will be," he said. "But this night, it's far from over." Tiana yawned and rubbed her eyes. "Are we going to be okay?" James looked at her, a small, genuine smile forming for the first time that day. "Yes, we're going to be okay." But deep down he knew that Thomas Green had opened a door, one that would force James to confront every part of his past, his choices, and the loneliness he had carried for decades. And he also knew that the next twist of this night's story was closer than he realized. The apartment was quiet again, but James couldn't settle. The encounter with Thomas Green lingered in his mind like a shadow, twisting over every detail of the day. He wandered toward the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the streets below. Snow had melted into slush in places, the city resuming its indifferent rhythm as if nothing had occurred. Tiana, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, tugged at Marlene's sleeve. "Mom, why is Mr. Whitmore so serious?" Marlene gave a small, knowing smile. "He's thinking, baby. Important things." James turned, catching the tail end of their conversation, and felt a pang of awareness. Tiana's curiosity, her innocence, reminded him of everything he had lost, or rather, everything he had deliberately set aside, in the pursuit of perfection and control. The phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting the quiet. James walked over, expecting another call from Felicia with updates on the Foundation investigation. Instead, it was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello." A woman's voice, low and measured, replied. "James Whitmore?" "Yes," he said cautiously. "Who is this?" "My name is Eleanor. I knew your father." The air seemed to shift. James's pulse quickened. His father had died decades ago, leaving behind a mountain of advice, expectations, and unresolved tension. To hear a stranger claim knowledge of him, especially now, was unnerving. "I have something for you," Eleanor continued. "Something that belonged to him. He wanted you to have it when the time was right." James frowned. "The time is now?" "Yes," she said simply. "Come to the address, I'll text you. Please. Tonight. Before it's too late." She hung up before he could ask more. James turned to Marlene, tension coiling in his chest. That was unexpected. Marlene's expression remained calm, though her eyes reflected curiosity and concern. "Do you want to go?" "I need to," he said, voice low, almost to himself. "I don't know why, but I feel compelled." Tiana frowned, a small knit of worry on her brow. "Compelled? Like magic?" James managed a tight smile. "Something like that." He quickly dressed, pulling on his coat and scarf, glancing back at the glowing apartment. The tree still twinkling, Tiana's rabbit tucked under her arm, Marlene quietly observing. A sense of unease settled over him. The night had already been full of surprises, lessons, and challenges. And now this, something from his father, from a life he had thought long buried, demanded attention. The cab ride was silent. James stared out at the city streets, passing familiar landmarks that now seemed foreign in the soft glow of the evening lights. Snow had returned lightly, frosting the roads, giving the world an almost dreamlike quality. When he arrived at the address, an old brick townhouse, he hesitated. The door creaked open before he could knock, revealing Eleanor. She was older, her face lined but firm, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Follow me," she said simply, leading him into the parlor. On a small table lay a wooden box, aged and polished with care. James approached it cautiously, every instinct screaming that this was more than it seemed. Eleanor watched him, silent, letting the weight of anticipation build. He opened the box slowly. Inside, a set of letters neatly bundled and a small, tarnished key. "These were your father's," Eleanor said softly. "He wrote them over many years. Things he never told you, decisions he never explained, and instructions only for you." James's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the first letter. His father's handwriting was meticulous, the ink faded but legible. He unfolded it, scanning the words. Reflections, confessions, and unexpected vulnerability that he had never associated with the man who had raised him. The next letter revealed something darker, a family secret James had never known, tied to an inheritance dispute, a lost relative, and the reason certain decisions were made in his early life. It reframed everything he thought he understood about his father, his childhood, and even his own relentless pursuit of wealth and control. James exhaled slowly, the weight of decades pressing into his chest. The night had already challenged him with hospital visits, a child's curiosity, betrayal by a trusted aide, and now his father's hidden truths demanded that he reevaluate not just his past, but the foundations of his life. Eleanor's voice broke the heavy silence. "He wanted you to know that even the strongest walls don't last forever. That understanding, compassion, and presence matter more than power alone." James looked down at the letters, the key, and the hidden truths. A chill ran through him, not from the cold outside, but from the realization that this Christmas night, his carefully constructed life was being dismantled piece by piece. And he knew deep inside that the next revelation would shake him even more, forcing him to confront not just his father's secrets, but the choices he had made in response to them. James walked back to the cab, the wooden box clutched tightly under his arm. The city felt different now, softer, quieter, as if the snow muffled more than sound, It seemed to have paused time itself. His mind raced with the letters he had just read. His father's confessions, his omissions, the family secrets, all of it pressed against his chest, heavy and insistent. Marlene had waited in the penthouse, pacing slightly, when he returned. She didn't ask questions immediately. She knew better than to force him into explanations. Tiana, now asleep on the couch, clutched her rabbit as though it could shield her from the weight of the night's events. James set the box on the kitchen counter, taking a deep breath. "There's more to my family than I knew," he admitted, voice low, tinged with exhaustion. "And things I thought I understood aren't what I thought at all." Marlene leaned against the counter. "Do you want to go through it now?" He shook his head. "Not yet. I need to process." "But—" his gaze fell on the small snow globe on the mantel. "I need to understand finally why I've built walls the way I have, and if it's time to let something in that isn't about control." Marlene nodded, silent but supportive. She understood that this was a turning point, not just a night of revelations but a night where James Whitmore, billionaire, controlled, distant, was beginning to confront himself. Hours passed. The penthouse was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the heater and the distant city noises below. James opened one of the letters, carefully unfolding the aged paper. His father wrote not only about financial decisions and family obligations but also about mistakes he had made, about moments he had failed to protect the people he loved. There were regrets, admissions of neglect, and instructions meant to guide James toward choices that balanced power with humanity. One letter, heavier than the rest, revealed the most shocking truth. A previously unknown sibling born shortly before James left for college, whom his father had kept secret due to legal and social complications. The letter included a name, a location, and a plea for James to seek connection if he ever truly wanted to understand family beyond wealth and appearances. James felt the ground shift beneath him. Every belief he had held about his life, his family, even his own identity was suddenly in question. His mother, Helen, had always seemed a constant, yet the letters suggested there had been fractures he had never perceived. The foundations of his childhood, and therefore his entire adult life, were built on partial truths. Marlene watched silently as James read, noting the subtle tremor in his hands, the way his jaw tightened as each word sunk in. She knew this moment demanded both patience and presence. It wasn't her place to intervene, only to witness. Finally, James closed the letter, exhaling sharply. I didn't know," he admitted, voice tight. "None of this. How could I have missed it?" "Because it wasn't meant for you until now," Marlene said softly. "Sometimes people protect truths to spare others. Or because they don't know how to share them." James sank into the armchair, the box still at his side, the snow globe reflecting dim light across the room. He realized that the night had delivered more than revelations. It had delivered responsibility. To himself, to the family he had never fully known, to the people who still relied on him, including Marlene and Tiana. He thought of Thomas Green's actions earlier, the challenge, the intrusion into his systems, the exposure of his vulnerabilities, and realized that the night's tests weren't finished. His control, his isolation, his detachment, they had all been challenged. And the most personal challenge was yet to come, seeking out a sibling he never knew existed. As he sat quietly, James finally allowed himself to acknowledge something he had long denied, that wealth, power, and isolation were no longer sufficient. That connection, understanding, and courage, emotional risks he had avoided, were now necessary. And somewhere deep inside he felt the stirrings of hope, not naive, not sudden, but a fragile ember. A possibility that this Christmas night, marked by betrayal, revelations, and secrets, could also mark the beginning of a life that was larger, more human, and more connected than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. James barely slept. When he did drift off, it came in short, fractured stretches, his mind replaying pieces of his father's handwriting, Thomas Green's voice on the phone, and the quiet weight of Tiana's presence in the apartment. By early morning, the city was still dark, Christmas lights blinking weakly against the gray-blue sky. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee, the wooden box open in front of him. The tarnished key lay beside the letters, catching the light every time he shifted. He had been avoiding it, pretending it was just another object, not a question waiting to be answered. Marlene moved quietly behind him, careful not to break the fragile stillness. "You didn't sleep," she said gently. "Neither did my thoughts," James replied. She glanced at the box. "Is that what's keeping you awake?" He nodded. "My father never gave me anything without a reason. This key, it opens something. A door, a storage unit, a safety deposit box. Whatever it is, it's not small." Marlene pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Are you afraid of what you'll find?" James considered that. "I think I'm afraid it'll explain too much." From the living room came the soft sound of Tiana humming to herself, still half asleep, dragging her rabbit across the carpet. She peeked around the corner. "Is today still Christmas?" she asked. James looked at her and smiled faintly. "It is." "Then you're supposed to open things?" she said matter-of-factly. The simplicity of it struck him harder than any letter had. He picked up the key. By mid-morning he had made arrangements. The address mentioned in the letter was across the river in New Jersey, tied to a private storage facility his father had quietly maintained for years. James had never known it existed. The drive felt longer than it was, the highway stretching out like a test of patience. The storage building was plain, forgettable, the kind of place no one looked at twice. James signed in under his name, the attendant barely reacting. Wealth had a way of becoming invisible in places like this. Unit 317. The key slid into the lock with an almost mocking ease. James paused before turning it, his hand resting there longer than necessary. Marlene stood a few steps back, giving him space. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "I know," he replied, then turned the key. The door rolled up with a metallic groan. Inside were neatly stacked boxes, all labeled in his father's careful handwriting. Documents, photo albums, framed certificates. But what caught James's attention was the small, battered suitcase at the back. He opened it slowly. Inside were clothes, women's and children's, folded with care. Beneath them, photographs. A young woman holding a baby. The same woman years later, standing outside a modest house. The baby growing older. James felt his throat tighten. "This is my sibling," he said quietly. Marlene stepped closer, her expression soft but serious. "Your father didn't just hide the truth," she said. "He preserved it." James picked up one photograph. On the back, a date and a name were written in faded ink. The name meant nothing to him, yet the face felt unsettlingly familiar. The same eyes. The same guarded expression. Another box contained legal documents, trust arrangements, and signed letters, plans that had never been completed. His father hadn't abandoned this other family. He had kept them at a distance, hovering in the shadows, unsure how to reconcile responsibility with reputation. James's hands clenched. "All those years," he said. "I thought he was cold, calculated. Turns out he was afraid." Marlene didn't answer right away. "Does that change how you see him?" James swallowed. "It changes how I see myself." The realization landed heavily. He had inherited more than wealth. He had inherited avoidance, silence, the habit of managing emotions instead of facing them. As they left the unit, James felt something shift. The questions were no longer abstract. Somewhere out there was a person who shared his blood, his past, and perhaps his loneliness. And unlike his father, James now knew. Back in the car, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "He's not the only one with secrets. Be careful who you trust next." James stared at the screen, pulse quickening. He looked out at the road ahead, the city slowly coming back into view, and understood one thing with unsettling clarity. This story wasn't finished revealing itself yet. The car ride back to Manhattan was heavy with silence. James stared out the window, watching the snow glint off streetlights, feeling an unfamiliar mix of anticipation and dread. The discovery at the storage unit had changed everything. He now had proof of a sibling he never knew existed, and a father whose carefully constructed image of control and coldness had been more complicated, more human than he had ever imagined. Marlene sat quietly beside him, her presence steady. She didn't pry, didn't offer easy reassurances. She simply let him think, Let him process, understanding that sometimes silence was the only thing a person needed to face truths like this. When they arrived at the penthouse, Tiana was awake, quietly stacking blocks on the living room floor. She looked up at James and grinned. "Did you find treasure?" He chuckled, a dry sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You could say that." Tiana frowned. "You're not smiling." "I'm thinking," James said simply. "Sometimes thinking isn't fun." Marlene helped him settle into the armchair with a blanket. "Do you want to look at the photos and letters?" James nodded. He opened the wooden box again, spreading the photographs across the coffee table. Each image told a story, of family life he had never known, of celebrations and milestones he hadn't been a part of a child who was his niece or nephew, or perhaps his sibling's own child. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up a letter written by his father, addressed to him but never sent. In it, his father expressed fear of judgment, of scandal, of failure, and a hope that James would someday understand. That understanding, James realized, was not about wealth or control, but about empathy, presence, and courage. Tiana leaned on the table, peering at the photographs. "Are these people nice?" James paused. "I hope so," he said softly. "I hope they are the kind of people who care, who love, who are safe." Marlene placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "And if they're not? If they're complicated or angry or hurt?" James exhaled slowly. "Then, we figure it out. Together." For the first time in years, James felt the weight of connection pressing in, not suffocating but grounding. The penthouse, the fire, the snow outside, the warmth of Marlene and Tiana, they all felt suddenly real, tangible, and fragile. He knew he couldn't undo decades of absence or misunderstanding. But he could start now. He could reach out. He could face the family he never knew, the sibling he had never met. And he could begin to break the pattern of isolation and control that had defined his life. As he carefully replaced the photographs and letters in the box, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. His heart tightened. "Mr. Whitmore," a man's voice said, clipped, urgent. "This is Detective Alvarez. We're investigating irregular activity tied to your foundation. Some transactions may involve fraudulent claims beyond what you've already uncovered. You need to come to the station." James froze. The night had been a cascade of revelations, family secrets, hidden siblings, betrayals, but now it extended beyond his apartment, beyond the snow globe, beyond letters and keys. The consequences were reaching outward, and he realized that his actions, his curiosity, and even his carelessness with trust could have far-reaching impact. Marlene's hand found his arm. "Do you need me?" James shook his head slowly. "I have to handle this. Alone." He rose from the armchair, straightening his coat, the penthouse suddenly too quiet, too still, as if holding its breath. Every lesson, every betrayal, every secret, every moment of connection, everything had led to this point. He stepped toward the door, ready to face the next challenge. But deep inside, he knew this was no ordinary investigation. This was a test of everything he had avoided for decades: responsibility, trust, and the courage to face the unknown consequences of a life built on control. Outside, the city shimmered under the snow, indifferent to his struggle. But James Whitmore, alone yet not entirely alone, was moving forward, ready to confront the forces that had quietly shaped and threatened his life. James drove through the quiet streets, the city still coated in a thin layer of snow that reflected the streetlights like scattered stars. His mind was spinning. The night had started with a simple act of kindness, helping a man outside the hospital, and had spiraled into revelations about Thomas Green, a hidden sibling, his father's secrets, and now a legal investigation that threatened to expose more than he had prepared for. The precinct was a short drive from the penthouse. He parked, walking through the fluorescent-lit corridors with a sense of cautious determination. Detective Alvarez met him in the lobby, a tall man with sharp eyes that seemed to see too much. "Mr. Whitmore," Alvarez said, extending his hand briefly before gesturing toward a private conference room. "I'm going to be direct. Some of your foundation's recent transactions are flagged for potential fraud. It appears someone manipulated the system to divert funds, but the investigation suggests there might be accomplices, or at least knowledge of the activity beyond Thomas Green. James felt a flicker of anger and disbelief. Thomas Green, he said, voice clipped, was involved. I discovered that earlier tonight. But accomplices? What are you implying? Alvarez leaned forward. It's possible this was a coordinated effort. We're not saying anyone on your staff was complicit yet, but the complexity suggests someone else may have had access. That's why we need your cooperation, full transparency. James ran a hand over his face. I've already had my day filled with surprises I never expected. Now you're telling me there may be more? How far does this go? Alvarez's expression remained unreadable. We don't know. But the fact that the funds eventually reached their intended destinations doesn't erase potential legal violations. Someone, Thomas Green or someone else, used your systems to redirect money in a way that could be criminal. You need to provide all access, passwords, and transaction histories. James nodded slowly. The weight of responsibility pressed down harder than ever. His empire had always been about control. Now that control had been challenged in ways that were personal, legal, and emotional. I'll cooperate fully, he said finally. But understand this wasn't my choice. And I intend to find every person responsible. Detective Alvarez stood. We'll start with the data you provide. Expect questions, follow-ups, and possibly subpoenas. And Mr. Whitmore? James looked up. Don't assume anyone is completely innocent. Even those closest to you could be hiding knowledge. The words struck harder than he expected. Marlene and Tiana flashed briefly in his mind, the warmth of their presence tonight standing in stark contrast to the cold, calculated warning. Trust had always been a fragile commodity for James, and now Alvarez had reminded him how easily it could crumble. Back in the cab, James stared out at the city, snowflakes drifting lazily in the streetlights. His mind was racing, family secrets, Thomas Green's games, a hidden sibling, and now potential legal peril. The threads of his life, which he had spent decades weaving into tight, predictable patterns, were unraveling. He returned to the penthouse later, exhaustion pressing against him, but sleep was still far away. Tiana had dozed back on the couch, rabbit in hand. Marlene stood by the window looking out, perhaps sensing the storm inside him. James set the wooden box on the coffee table again, feeling its weight, the letters and photographs now seeming even more symbolic. A life built on control, secrecy, and avoidance had been exposed tonight, and the night was far from over. He sank into the armchair, eyes on the snow globe, thinking of Thomas Green, Detective Alvarez, and the sibling he hadn't yet met. The world he had built, polished and invulnerable, was proving fragile in ways he had never imagined. And he realized something vital. Tonight he would be tested not just by external forces, but by himself, by his capacity to confront betrayal, accept unexpected truths, and embrace vulnerability he had spent decades avoiding. The snow outside intensified, blanketing the streets. The penthouse, warm and glowing, felt like an island, but James knew it could not protect him from the challenges now barreling toward him. And he knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that the next moment could change everything. James barely touched his dinner. The penthouse felt simultaneously safe and confining, the soft glow of Christmas lights from the tree casting long shadows across the floor. The city outside was hushed under fresh snow, but inside, James's mind raced with the impossibility of quiet. Thomas Green, the hidden sibling, his father's letters, and now Detective Alvarez's warnings, each revelation stacked upon the last, a tower of uncertainty he hadn't known he was capable of navigating. Marlene poured herself a cup of tea and sat across from him at the table. You've been tense all night, she said softly. You need to rest even for a few minutes. James rubbed his temples. Rest feels dangerous right now. I've never felt so exposed in my life. Tiana wandered in, still sleepy, her small hands clutching her rabbit. Are we in danger? She asked innocently. James forced a dry smile. No, sweetheart. Not danger like you think. Just surprises. Her brow furrowed. Surprises aren't scary? They can be, he admitted. But they're part of life. Part of learning too. The conversation, simple, grounding, reminded him that the night's chaos had also revealed unexpected anchors. Marlene's calm presence, Tiana's unfiltered curiosity, the tiny snow globe glowing on the mantel. For decades, James had relied on wealth, strategy, and control to navigate life. Now he realized he had to rely on human connection, a far more unpredictable but necessary tool. A soft knock at the door startled him. James set down his cup and crossed the room. Standing there, coated in a light dusting of snow, was a man James didn't recognize. He held a small envelope and a cautious expression. "Mr. Whitmore?" the man asked. "Delivery. Personal. Came through a secure courier." James took the envelope, noting the elegant handwriting, curved, precise, familiar somehow. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. "James," it began, "I know you are learning things about yourself tonight that unsettle you. Do not think that Thomas Green's challenge is the only test. The choices you make from here, who you trust, how you act, will determine more than your wealth. They will determine who you are." The signature was a simple A. James's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected guidance, mysterious, cryptic, and almost paternal in tone. But the message carried weight, the kind that made him sit down heavily, processing the implication. Someone was watching, someone who understood the stakes of his life, and perhaps even the personal growth he had long avoided. Marlene looked at him expectantly. "Who is it?" James shook his head. "I don't know. But I think it matters that I pay attention." The phone rang, slicing through the quiet. "Detective Alvarez." James answered quickly, bracing himself. "Mr. Whitmore," Alvarez said, urgency sharpening his voice. "We've traced additional anomalies. Someone accessed Thomas Green's diversion earlier than we thought. We're not sure of their identity yet, but it could be someone closer to you than either of you realize." James's stomach tightened. Betrayal had been a theme all night. First Green, now perhaps someone else. The careful structure of his world, foundation, family, empire, was cracking in multiple directions simultaneously. He hung up, staring at the envelope in his hands and the snow globe on the mantel. Connection, vulnerability, trust, words he had avoided, systems he had controlled, now seemed like both shield and weapon. Marlene stepped closer, placing her hand over his. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "you're not alone." James nodded, feeling a flicker of something unfamiliar, cautious hope. He wasn't just James Whitmore, the billionaire who managed everything with precision. Tonight, he was James Whitmore, a man facing choices he couldn't calculate, confronting truths he couldn't control, and realizing that the people around him, fragile as they might be, were now part of the equation. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, covering mistakes, revealing paths, and reminding him that some forces, love, family, connection, couldn't be contained, predicted, or purchased. And as he returned to the armchair by the fire, letters, envelopes, and photographs surrounding him, James knew that the night's greatest revelation was still waiting, something that would test not just his mind, his wealth, or his power, but the very capacity of his heart. James barely slept that night. The city outside the penthouse seemed quieter than usual, the occasional hum of a distant car punctuating the otherwise serene winter silence. But inside, James's mind churned with revelations, challenges, and a gnawing awareness that his carefully controlled world was unraveling piece by piece. Morning light spilled across the living room, illuminating the snow globe on the mantel, which seemed to shimmer as if urging him forward. He traced the swirl of the tiny snowflakes, thinking about Thomas Green, the sibling he had never met, his father's hidden letters, and the cryptic warning from the mysterious A. Tiana bounded into the room, tugging at Marlene's sleeve. "Daddy, can we make cookies?" she asked, her voice a cheerful interruption to the tension that hung in the apartment. James allowed himself a small smile. "Cookies sound perfect," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. As Marlene set out the ingredients, James moved toward the study, the letters and photographs still spread across the desk. One envelope caught his attention, an older letter he hadn't yet opened, tucked beneath the others. The handwriting was his father's, more hurried than usual, almost desperate. He unfolded it carefully. "James," it began, If you are reading this, it means the time has come. There are truths you must know, about me, about your family, and about yourself. Trust will be tested tonight in ways you cannot yet imagine. Be careful who you believe, and remember, not all challenges are visible. Some come disguised as people you hold dear. The letter ended with a faint, scrawled signature, H. James's pulse quickened. His father's warnings were clear, almost prophetic. He had already faced Thomas Green, uncovered a hidden sibling, and been warned about potential betrayal within his foundation. And now, he had a personal reminder that the night was not yet over, that more tests were coming, disguised as ordinary interactions, decisions, and choices. He sat back in the chair, trying to gather his thoughts. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like never before. Every person around him, from Marlene and Tiana to his employees, could be involved in ways he didn't yet understand. Even his own judgments were under scrutiny. The day unfolded in a tense rhythm. James returned calls to Felicia, ensuring the Foundation's transactions were fully traced. Detective Alvarez's office had provided additional details. Someone had accessed internal records remotely, but the IP addresses pointed to multiple locations, making it impossible to pinpoint the culprit immediately. James's mind raced. Each anomaly, each unexpected revelation, seemed carefully orchestrated, almost like pieces of a larger puzzle. By late afternoon, Marlene suggested they take a brief walk outside. The fresh snow sparkled under the winter sun, the city buzzing quietly in the background. Tiana ran ahead, leaving tiny footprints, giggling as she chased imaginary snowflakes. James followed slowly, the cold air clearing some of the fog in his mind. He thought about his father's letters, the cryptic messages, and Thomas Green's actions. The challenges tonight weren't simply tests of wealth or control, they were tests of character, resilience, and trust. Returning to the penthouse, James noticed movement near the window, a delivery van he didn't recognize. The driver handed a small package to Marlene, who glanced at James with concern. He took the box, noting its unmarked exterior and the weight inside. Inside was a single photograph, a candid image of Thomas Green with someone James didn't recognize, standing outside the penthouse earlier that evening. On the back was a note in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Watch closely. Not everyone is who they seem. A chill ran down his spine. Every revelation, every confrontation tonight had pointed to deception, manipulation, and hidden truths. And now James realized the night's final lessons were approaching. Forces and people he trusted, challenges he hadn't anticipated, and truths that could reshape his understanding of loyalty, family, and himself. He placed the photo carefully on the mantel beside the snow globe, Marlene by his side, Tiana asleep once again. James exhaled slowly. The night was far from over. And he understood, with unnerving clarity, that he was about to face a moment that would test not just his intellect or wealth, but the very essence of who James Whitmore was, and who he could become. The penthouse felt unusually still. The quiet wasn't comforting, it was loaded, charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting. James sat at the desk, the photograph from the mysterious delivery placed beside the snow globe, its presence unsettling him more than any letter or revelation had so far. Marlene sat nearby, reading quietly, sensing the tension but respecting his need for focus. Tiana had been asleep for hours, her small form curled under a blanket on the couch. James's mind, however, refused rest. Every interaction of the night, every message, every hidden secret kept replaying with a clarity that was almost unbearable. James picked up the photograph again. Thomas Green was smiling casually, but the other man, he didn't know who it was, held himself with a confidence that unsettled James. Something about the angle of the photo suggested it had been taken deliberately, almost like a warning. A soft chime broke the silence. His phone. An unknown number. "Mr. Whitmore," a calm, deliberate voice said. "I believe it's time we met. You've seen the letters, you've uncovered the secrets. Now it's time to see the bigger picture." James's jaw tightened. "Who is this?" "You'll know soon enough," the voice replied. "Meet me at Pier 47. Midnight. Alone. Come prepared to accept the truth about the people you trust, and those you don't, The line went dead. James stared at the phone, a chill crawling over his spine. Every revelation of the night had escalated in stakes. Thomas Green's betrayal, his father's hidden family, cryptic warnings, the legal investigation. And now a direct challenge. Marlene noticed the phone in his hand. Who was that? James shook his head slowly. I don't know. But I think it's someone connected to everything we've uncovered tonight. Are you going? She asked quietly. James considered it. Every instinct screamed caution. Every part of him wanted to gather more information first, to wait, to plan. But something deeper, curiosity, accountability, a need for closure, pushed him forward. I have to, he said. I need to know the truth. By the time he arrived at Pier 47, the city was hushed, the winter air sharp and biting. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting lazily toward the water. The pier stretched into darkness, illuminated only by dim, flickering lights. James moved cautiously, the sound of his boots muted by the snow. A figure stepped out from the shadows. Thomas Green. James froze. You? Thomas's expression was unreadable. You made it, he said softly. I wasn't sure you would. James narrowed his eyes. What is this? Another game? Thomas shook his head slowly. Not a game, James. A lesson. You've learned about your father, your family, your secrets. But understanding those truths isn't enough. You need to confront what loyalty, trust, and responsibility really mean. James's heart pounded. And the person in the photograph? Thomas's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly. Someone closer to you than you think. Someone who has been testing your judgment alongside me. Your world isn't as simple as you imagined. It never was. James's stomach twisted. Every warning, every anomaly, every cryptic message. The pieces were finally converging. And the realization hit him. The night had been orchestrated not just to expose his vulnerabilities but to force him to see beyond control, beyond wealth, and into the people he truly relied upon. You've manipulated enough, Green, James said, voice low but firm. Who else is involved? Thomas's lips curved slightly. That, James, is for you to discover. Before James could respond, Thomas stepped back, slipping into the shadows. By the time James moved forward, he was gone. Only the cold wind and falling snow remained, and a single envelope left on the pier where Thomas had stood. James picked it up with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph of Marlene, Tiana, and him taken earlier in the penthouse. Someone had been watching all along. And beneath it, a note. The final test is trust. Will you protect them or let the past define your choices? James's breath caught. The night had started with snow, a hospital, and a simple act of kindness. Now it had escalated into revelations, confrontations, and a challenge that threatened not just his empire or his reputation, but the people he cared about most. He turned back toward the city lights, snow falling heavier now, and realized with startling clarity, the true test was not wealth, power, or control. It was his heart. And tomorrow, Christmas Day, would demand the answers he had avoided for decades. Christmas morning arrived quietly. No alarms. No urgent calls. Just a pale winter light slipping through the tall windows of the penthouse, settling gently over everything James Whitmore had spent his life building, and nearly lost in a single night. James stood by the window, coffee untouched in his hand. The city below was waking up, unaware of the storm that had raged inside him since midnight. Pier 47. Thomas Green. The photograph. The note. The final test is trust. Behind him, soft footsteps. Marlene. You didn't sleep, she said, not as a question. James shook his head. Too much to think about. She joined him at the window. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt different now. Honest. I know something happened last night, Marlene said carefully. I don't need every detail. But I need to know one thing. She turned to him. Are we safe? James met her eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't hide behind confidence or control. I don't know, he admitted. But I know this, I won't let anyone hurt you or Tiana. Not ever. Marlene studied his face, searching for doubt. Finding none, she nodded. From the couch came a small yawn. Tiana sat up, hair tousled, eyes blinking sleep away. "Is it Christmas?" she asked. James smiled. "A real one this time." "It is." They gathered around the small tree by the window. No extravagant gifts, no cameras. Just simple boxes, warm laughter, and a feeling James hadn't experienced since childhood: presence. Tiana tore open a gift and gasped. "You remembered," she said, holding up a sketchbook. James knelt in front of her. "You said you liked to draw stories. I thought, maybe you could tell your own." She hugged him without warning. Tight. Fearless. Something inside James cracked open. Later that morning, as snow continued to fall, James made the call he had avoided all his life. His half-sister answered on the second ring. "I don't expect forgiveness," James said when she finally spoke. "But I want to stop pretending you don't exist. Whatever you need, I'm here." There was a long pause. Then a quiet, trembling breath. "That's all I ever wanted," she said. The final move came just before noon. James walked into his private office, opened the envelope Thomas Green had left behind, and placed its contents into the shredder. Contracts, leverage, secrets meant to control him. He picked up his phone and sent one message to his legal team. "Terminate Green's influence. Publicly. Cleanly. No retaliation." Then another message, to the unknown number. "You wanted to test my trust. Here's your answer. Stay away from my family." No reply came. None was needed. That evening, the penthouse filled with soft music and the scent of food. Marlene cooked. Tiana narrated a dramatic story she was drawing about a brave girl who saved a lost king. James listened. Really listened. He realized then what the night had been trying to teach him. Power didn't protect people. Presence did. Control didn't create loyalty. Love did. And redemption didn't come from fixing the past, but choosing differently now. As the snow fell outside, James Whitmore sat on the floor beside a child who trusted him and a woman who believed in him, knowing his life had finally shifted, not because of money or fear, but because of a single choice to be human. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us that kindness can change everything. And if you've ever faced a moment that forced you to choose between who you were and who you wanted to be, feel free to share it in the comments. Some nights test your power. Others reveal your heart. And those change your life forever.